The iron rails stretched across the American continent like veins of ambition, carrying the lifeblood of a nation desperate to conquer its own vastness. But in the shadows of progress, in the quiet corners where wealth accumulated like dust in forgotten rooms, there existed stories that history preferred to bury. This is one of those stories, a tale of a mansion so magnificent it could make emperors weep, built by a man whose empire stretched further than the eye could see, yet whose downfall would echo through the marble halls of his greatest creation like the whisper of a ghost that refuses to leave. Before we descend into the darkness of this tale, welcome to the dark estate, where we uncover the sinister secrets hidden behind the grandest facades of history. If you're fascinated by the corruption, greed, and tragedy that lurks beneath gilded surfaces, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Give this video a like if you appreciate deep dives into the shadowy corners of the past, and please leave a comment below telling us what you think about this story or what dark historical mystery you'd like us to explore next. Your support keeps us digging through the archives, uncovering the tales that powerful families wished would remain buried forever. Now, let's return to our story. The year was 1873, and America was drunk on the promise of its own greatness. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed just 4 years earlier, and the men who had orchestrated this feat were treated as gods among mortals. They were the railroad kings, the barons of steel and steam, and none stood taller in the public imagination than James Fitzgerald Blackwood. His name appeared in newspapers with the regularity of sunrise, always associated with another triumph, another acquisition, another impossibility made manifest through sheer force of will and an apparently bottomless well of capital. Blackwood had risen from circumstances that were comfortable but unremarkable. His father had been a successful merchant in Boston, dealing in imported textiles and fine goods from Europe. Young James had received an education befitting a gentleman, attending Harvard, where he studied mathematics and engineering with an intensity that his classmates found unsettling. While other young men of his social standing spent their evenings in taverns or pursuing romantic entanglements, Blackwood could be found in his dormitory, surrounded by maps and calculations, envisioning a future that existed only in his fevered imagination. He saw what others could not, or perhaps what others refused to see. The railroad was not merely a means of transportation, it was the key to controlling the entire economic infrastructure of a nation. Whoever controlled the rails controlled the movement of goods, the flow of people, the pulse of commerce itself. It was a monopoly disguised as progress, and Blackwood intended to seize it with both hands. His first venture into railroad investment came at the age of 26, when he used his inheritance and a substantial loan from a family friend to purchase a controlling interest in a failing short-line railroad that connected Boston to several manufacturing towns in the interior of Massachusetts. The railroad was hemorrhaging money, mismanaged by a board of directors who viewed it as a gentlemanly hobby rather than a business. Blackwood changed everything. He fired half the workforce, renegotiated contracts with suppliers, and increased rates for freight customers who had no alternative means of transportation. Within 2 years, the railroad was profitable. Within 5, it had absorbed 3 neighboring lines, and had become an essential artery of commerce in the region. But this was merely the apprenticeship. Blackwood's true ambition lay westward, where the vast territories beyond the Mississippi represented not just opportunity but destiny. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act had been signed into law, granting enormous subsidies and land grants to companies willing to undertake the monumental task of connecting the coasts. Blackwood saw his chance. He sold his interests in the eastern railroads at what his contemporaries thought was the peak of the market, consolidating his wealth into liquid capital that he could deploy with surgical precision. What followed was a campaign of acquisition and construction that stunned even the most ambitious of his rivals. Blackwood formed the Continental Transportation Company, a corporate entity so complex in its structure that even experienced financiers struggled to understand where its money came from and where it went. He recruited engineers from the best universities in America and Europe, offering salaries that were obscene by the standards of the day. He lobbied congressmen with a sophistication that bordered on puppetry, ensuring that government contracts and land grants flowed toward his enterprises like water finding its level. The railroad he built was a marvel of engineering and a monument to human suffering. Thousands of workers, many of them Irish and Chinese immigrants, labored in conditions that would be considered criminal by any moral standard. They died in explosions, in cavines, from exposure and disease and accidents that were reported in company logs with the emotional weight of arithmetic. Blackwood never visited these work sites. He remained in his offices in New York and Philadelphia, surrounded by maps marked with red lines that represented not miles of track but calculations of profit, each line a vein through which money would flow into his coffers for generations to come. By 1870, Blackwood's railroad empire had become one of the largest in the nation. His trains carried cattle from Texas, timber from the Pacific Northwest, minerals from the mountain territories, and grain from the endless plains of the Midwest. He had achieved what he had envisioned in those lonely nights at Harvard. The seemingly impossible made real through ruthlessness disguised as vision, and with this achievement came wealth that exceeded even his own ambitious projections. Money flowed to him in rivers, in floods, in numbers so large they became abstract, losing their connection to anything tangible or real. It was at this moment of supreme triumph that Blackwood decided to build his mansion, not just any mansion, but a structure that would stand as a physical manifestation of his power. A place where he could entertain presidents and foreign dignitaries, where every room would whisper of his greatness, where future generations would walk in wonder and speak his name with reverence. He had conquered the continent. Now he would build a palace worthy of a conqueror. The location he chose was significant in ways that revealed much about his psychology. Rather than building in an established center of wealth like New York or Boston, Blackwood selected a remote area in the Hudson Valley, a vast estate of nearly 3,000 acres that overlooked the river like a fortress overlooking the approach of enemies. The land itself cost a fortune, purchased from several families who had farmed it for generations and who found themselves unable to refuse the sums Blackwood offered. Some went willingly, seduced by money beyond their dreams. Others left with bitterness in their hearts, forced out through legal maneuvers and financial pressure that Blackwood's lawyers applied with methodical cruelty. For the design of his mansion, Blackwood did not simply hire an architect. He launched what amounted to an international competition, soliciting proposals from the most renowned designers in America and Europe. He received submissions from men who had built palaces for royalty, who had designed cathedrals and parliament buildings, who understood that architecture could be a language of power spoken in stone and steel. After reviewing dozens of proposals, Blackwood selected a French architect named Auguste Durand, whose vision for the mansion combined elements of French chateau, Italian Renaissance palace, and innovations in engineering that would make the structure one of the most technologically advanced private residences in the world. The plans that Durand created were staggering in their ambition. The main house would contain 120 rooms, including 40 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, a ballroom capable of accommodating 500 guests, a library with space for 50,000 volumes, a dining room with a table that could seat 60, an indoor swimming pool, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, and a private theater. The mansion would be constructed of limestone quarried specifically for the project, with marble imported from Italy for the grand staircases and entrance hall. The roof would be copper, which would oxidize over time to create a distinctive green patina. 16 chimneys would rise from the roofline, like the towers of a medieval fortress. But the true extravagance lay in the details, in the elements that most visitors would never notice but which consumed enormous resources and demonstrated Blackwood's determination to create something unprecedented. The mansion would have its own power plant, generating electricity years before such systems became common. It would have a central heating system utilizing steam pipes running through the walls, ensuring comfort in even the harshest winter. The plumbing system would be revolutionary, with hot and cold running water in every bathroom, a feature that even the finest hotels of the era could not offer. Durand designed a ventilation system that would circulate fresh air throughout the mansion, replacing the stale atmosphere that plagued most large buildings of the period. The grounds surrounding the mansion would be equally magnificent. Blackwood hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the renowned landscape architect who had designed Central Park, to create gardens and parkland that would transform the raw countryside into a vision of Arcadian perfection. Olmsted's plan included formal gardens in the French style, with geometric patterns of hedges and fountains, as well as naturalistic landscapes with carefully placed groves of trees and artificial lakes fed by diverted streams. There would be greenhouses for exotic plants, stables for 100 horses, and cottages for the army of staff required to maintain such an estate. Construction began in the spring of 1871, and from the first day it was clear that this would be no ordinary building project. Blackwood allocated what his accountants initially estimated would be $2 million for the construction, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. A railroad spur was built directly to the construction site to facilitate the delivery of materials. Hundreds of workers were employed, including master craftsmen brought from Europe for specialized tasks. Italian artisans carved the marble. French craftsmen created the intricate plaster work for the ceilings. German metalworkers forged the decorative ironwork for the grand staircase. The construction site became a small city unto itself, with dormitories for workers, cookhouses, supply depots, and workshops where components of the mansion were fabricated before being installed in the main structure. Blackwood visited regularly during the first year, arriving by private train car and inspecting the progress with an intensity that made the contractors nervous. He questioned every decision, demanded changes to designs already approved, and insisted on materials that were more expensive and harder to source than originally specified. When Auguste Durand protested that some of Blackwood's demands would compromise the architectural integrity of the design, Blackwood simply increased the architect's fee and told him to find a way to make it work. As the mansion rose from the earth, it began to attract attention from newspapers and magazines. Journalists traveled to the site and published breathless accounts of the scale and luxury of Blackwood's palace. As it came to be known in the press, illustrations appeared in Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, showing the mansion in various stages of completion, its walls rising against the sky like the ramparts of a fortress. The public was fascinated. Here was a man who had conquered the wilderness, who had bound the nation together with iron rails, and who was now building a home that rivaled the greatest residences of European nobility. But beneath the newspaper accounts and the public fascination, another story was unfolding, one that would not become clear until much later. The cost of the mansion was spiraling out of control. The original estimate of $2 million proved to be wildly optimistic. By the end of the first year, Blackwood had already spent $3 million, and the mansion was perhaps one-third complete. The problem lay not in any single element but in the cumulative effect of Blackwood's perfectionism and Duran's increasingly elaborate designs. Every room became a showcase of craftsmanship. The library's ceiling was covered in frescoes depicting scenes from classical mythology, painted by an artist brought from Florence specifically for this commission. The ballroom's floor was inlaid with patterns of contrasting woods so intricate that it took craftsmen 2 years to complete. The indoor swimming pool was lined with tiles hand-painted in Portugal and shipped across the Atlantic. Blackwood paid these bills without apparent concern. His railroad empire continued to generate enormous profits, and he had access to credit that seemed unlimited. Banks competed for the privilege of lending to him, viewing his ventures as secure investments backed by hard assets and steady revenue. When contractors presented invoices that exceeded estimates by factors of 2 or 3, Blackwood authorized payment with barely a glance at the paperwork. He was a man possessed by a vision, and money was merely a tool to realize that vision, no more significant than the limestone and marble and timber that were being transformed into his monument. Yet there were signs, small at first, that the foundation of Blackwood's empire was not as solid as it appeared. In 1872, a minor financial panic swept through Wall Street, triggered by the failure of several prominent banking houses that had overextended themselves in railroad speculation. Blackwood's stocks suffered along with the broader market, though they recovered quickly. More concerning, though few noticed at the time, was that some of Blackwood's railroads were beginning to face competition from rival lines that had been built with more recent technology and more efficient routes. The freight rates that Blackwood could charge were coming under pressure, and in several markets his railroads were losing business to competitors who could offer lower prices. Blackwood responded to these challenges in character, with aggression and expansion. He authorized the construction of new rail lines to compete directly with his rivals, entering rate wars where his railroads carried freight at prices that barely covered operating costs, betting that he could outlast his competitors in a war of attrition. He purchased controlling interests in coal mines and steel mills, vertically integrating his operations to reduce costs. He began work on a grand terminal in Chicago that would cement his position as the dominant force in Midwestern transportation. Each of these moves required capital, and Blackwood financed them through increasingly complex arrangements involving bonds, stock offerings, and personal loans secured against his other assets. All the while, the mansion continued to consume money at a rate that would have alarmed anyone paying close attention to Blackwood's overall financial position. By 1873, he had spent more than $7 million on the project, and it was still not complete. The main structure was finished, and many of the rooms were furnished, but work continued on the grounds, on the elaborate mechanical systems that Blackwood insisted be installed and perfected. Olmsted's landscape plan had expanded to include features not in the original design, including an artificial waterfall that required extensive engineering work to create the illusion of natural beauty. The mansion had become more than a residence. It had become an obsession, a black hole into which Blackwood poured resources with a compulsion that seemed to overwhelm his usual business judgment. His friends and business associates began to notice changes in his demeanor. He had always been intense, driven, focused to the point of rudeness. But now there was something else, a quality that some described as desperation, though what he was desperate for remained unclear. He spoke of the mansion constantly, describing features and details with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. He insisted that visitors tour the property even when it was muddy and unfinished, walking them through rooms still filled with construction debris, describing what each space would become with a fervor that made some uncomfortable. In September of 1873, the financial world that Blackwood had navigated with such confidence collapsed around him. The failure of J. Cook & Company, a banking house that had been a pillar of American finance, triggered a panic that spread through the markets like fire through dry timber. Stock prices plummeted, credit evaporated. Businesses that had seemed invincible found themselves unable to secure the loans necessary to continue operations. The Panic of 1873, as it came to be known, would lead to an economic depression that lasted for years and destroyed fortunes that had seemed unshakable. Blackwood's railroad empire was particularly vulnerable. His aggressive expansion had left him overextended, dependent on continued access to credit to service his debts and fund ongoing operations. When the credit markets froze, he found himself in an impossible position. The bonds he had issued to finance new construction came due, and he could not refinance them. Banks that had been eager to lend to him months earlier now refused to take his calls. Freight revenues declined as the Depression reduced economic activity, leaving his railroad struggling to cover even their operating expenses. The first crack in the facade appeared in October, when Blackwood was forced to suspend dividend payments on his railroad's stock. This sent shockwaves through the investment community, as Blackwood's enterprises had been considered among the most reliable in the nation. The stock price of his companies collapsed, falling by more than 70% in a matter of weeks. Bondholders began demanding their money, and when Blackwood could not pay, some initiated legal proceedings. Creditors who had been content to wait for payment when times were good now insisted on immediate settlement of their accounts. Blackwood fought to save his empire with the same ruthless determination he had shown in building it. He liquidated assets, selling profitable divisions of his business at distressed prices to raise cash. He negotiated with creditors, offering equity stakes in his companies in exchange for forbearance on debt payments. He lobbied government officials for assistance, arguing that his railroads were vital infrastructure that deserved public support. For a time it seemed that he might succeed in weathering the storm. Several major creditors agreed to restructuring deals that gave Blackwood breathing room, and there were signs that the panic might be easing. But the mansion, his beautiful, terrible mansion, had become an anchor dragging him into the depths. He had borrowed against it, using the property as collateral for loans that he had assumed he would be able to repay from his railroad revenues. When those revenues collapsed, he found himself unable to service these debts. The banks that held the mortgages on the mansion began foreclosure proceedings. Blackwood, who had built an empire on his ability to outmaneuver competitors and bend financial markets to his will, discovered that he could not negotiate with the inexorable logic of compound interest and contractual obligations. In December of 1873, just as winter was settling over the Hudson Valley, covering the grounds of the mansion in snow that softened its harsh grandeur, Blackwood was forced to declare bankruptcy. It was not a simple bankruptcy but a catastrophic collapse that involved dozens of corporate entities, hundreds of creditors, and assets scattered across the continent. The legal proceedings would take years to untangle, but the immediate result was clear. James Fitzgerald Blackwood, who had been one of the richest and most powerful men in America, was financially destroyed. The mansion, still unfinished in some of its details, stood as a monument to hubris. Creditors fought over it like wolves over a carcass, each claiming a right to the property based on different loans and liens. The courts eventually awarded it to a consortium of banks who found themselves in possession of an asset they had no idea what to do with. The mansion was too large and too expensive to maintain as a private residence for anyone except a person of extraordinary wealth, and in the Depression years following the Panic of 1873, such people were scarce and careful with their money. Blackwood himself became a ghost, both literally and figuratively. He withdrew from public life, living in rented rooms in New York City, a fallen titan whose name had become synonymous with overreach and failure. Newspaper editorials that had once praised his vision now condemned his recklessness. Cartoonists drew caricatures of him as a symbol of the excesses of the Gilded Age, a man who had reached too far and fallen into ruin. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, and refused to discuss the mansion or his bankruptcy. Those who encountered him during this period reported that he seemed diminished, physically smaller somehow, as though the weight of his failure had compressed him. The mansion itself entered a strange liminal state. The consortium of banks that owned it tried unsuccessfully to sell the property for several years. They found no buyers willing to take on the burden of maintaining such a vast estate. The asking price dropped steadily, from $5 million to $3 million to $1 million, and still there were no offers. Meanwhile, the mansion sat empty. The staff that Blackwood had begun to hire was dismissed. The grounds which Olmsted had shaped into such careful beauty began to deteriorate. Without constant maintenance, the formal gardens became overgrown, the fountains stopped flowing, and the artificial lakes developed thick mats of algae. Looters discovered the mansion in the spring of 18. Despite its remote location, word had spread that it contained valuable fixtures and furnishings that could be stripped and sold. Thieves broke windows to gain entry and made off with anything portable, from brass doorknobs to marble mantelpieces to sections of the decorative ironwork from the grand staircase. The banks hired a caretaker to live on the property and protect it. But one man could do little to secure a building with 120 rooms. The theft continued, each burglary leaving the mansion a little more damaged, a little more skeletal. Local people began to regard the mansion with a mixture of fascination and unease. Stories circulated about the property, tales that grew in the telling. Some said they had seen lights in the windows at night, impossible given that the mansion had no occupants and no source of power. Others reported hearing music drifting from the empty ballroom, the sound of an orchestra playing waltzes for dancers who were not there. Teenagers dared each other to approach the mansion after dark, and some claimed to have seen a figure walking the halls, a man in formal dress who vanished when approached. The mansion acquired a reputation as a haunted place, cursed by the misfortune of its creator. The truth was both more prosaic and more tragic. Blackwood, it emerged later, had become obsessed with the mansion even after losing it. On several occasions during 1875 and 1876, he traveled from New York to the Hudson Valley and trespassed on the property that had once been his. He would break into the mansion through one of the many unsecured entrances and wander through the rooms, perhaps reliving his dreams of glory, perhaps confronting the monument to his failure. The caretaker reported these intrusions to the banks, who instructed their lawyers to obtain a restraining order prohibiting Blackwood from coming within a mile of the property. But enforcement was difficult, and Blackwood continued his nocturnal visits. It was during one of these visits, in March of 1877, that James Fitzgerald Blackwood died. The caretaker found his body in the library, the room whose frescoed ceiling depicted scenes from classical mythology. Blackwood had apparently suffered a heart attack while sitting in one of the leather chairs that had survived the looters. He was 53 years old. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to indicate what had driven him to return to this place one final time. His pockets contained a flask of whiskey, mostly empty, and a letter from one of his daughters, who had written asking him to visit her family in Philadelphia. He had not responded to the letter. The newspapers that had chronicled Blackwood's rise and fall gave his death modest coverage. The man who had once commanded front-page headlines received brief obituaries that summarized his career in a few paragraphs, noting his role in railroad development and his spectacular bankruptcy. The tone was neither celebratory nor sympathetic, but rather as though Blackwood had already faded into history and his death was merely the formal conclusion of a story whose ending had been written years earlier. He was buried in a modest plot in a cemetery in Brooklyn, far from the grand mausoleum he had once planned to build on the grounds of his mansion. The mansion itself outlived its creator, but not in any form that Blackwood would have recognized or desired. In 1879, the property was finally sold, not to a wealthy industrialist or a family of means, but to a developer who saw opportunity in its failure. He purchased the mansion and its grounds for $250,000, a fraction of what Blackwood had spent building it. The developer's plan was to subdivide the estate, demolish the mansion, and build a community of smaller homes that could be sold to the growing middle class. Local preservationists protested this plan, arguing that the mansion, despite its association with Blackwood's failure, represented an important example of Gilded Age architecture and should be preserved. They formed a committee, raised money, and attempted to convince the developer to sell them the property. They were unsuccessful. The developer had made his calculations and determined that the value of the land far exceeded any potential use for the mansion itself. The economics were clear, and economics, as Blackwood had learned too late, were inexorable. The demolition began in the summer of 1880. It proved to be a more difficult task than the developer had anticipated. The mansion had been built to last for centuries, its foundations deep, its walls thick, its construction solid. Workers spent weeks reducing it to rubble, using explosives to bring down sections of wall that would not yield to slip. The sound of the demolition echoed through the Hudson Valley, a prolonged death rattle that could be heard for miles. Local residents gathered to watch, some with satisfaction at seeing the symbol of Blackwood's arrogance destroyed, others with a sense of melancholy at the loss of something that, whatever its origins, had been undeniably magnificent. As the mansion came down, revealing its interior to the open sky before the walls themselves were demolished, the workers made discoveries that added new layers to the story. Hidden within the walls were bottles of wine and spirits that Blackwood had apparently secreted away, creating cash throughout the building for reasons known only to himself. In the basement, they found extensive wine cellars that still contained thousands of bottles, a fortune in rare vintages that had somehow escaped the attention of looters. These were auctioned off, bringing the developer unexpected revenue that helped offset the high cost of demolition. More disturbing were the documents that were found in various locations throughout the mansion. These were papers that Blackwood had apparently been storing in the building during his secret visits, perhaps unable to bear keeping them in his rented rooms where they would have been a constant reminder of his failure. The documents included correspondence with business associates that revealed the full extent of Blackwood's financial manipulation, showing how he had used complex corporate structures to hide the true state of his debts. There were also personal letters, including several from his wife, who had separated from him after the bankruptcy and who had died in 1876, a year before Blackwood's own death. Her letters revealed a woman who had watched her husband's obsession with the mansion with growing alarm and who had begged him to stop the construction before it was too late. He had not listened. The documents were turned over to lawyers who were still working to untangle Blackwood's bankruptcy, and they provided ammunition for creditors who argued that Blackwood had engaged in fraud. However, since Blackwood was dead and his estate was already insolvent, this discovery had little practical effect beyond adding another layer of ignominy to his legacy. The papers were eventually deposited in archives where they remained largely unexamined for decades, gathering dust like the rubble of the mansion itself. By 1881, the demolition was complete. The mansion that had consumed $7 million and countless hours of labor had been reduced to a field of broken stone and twisted metal. Some of the materials were salvaged and sold, including marble that was purchased by builders in New York who used it in other projects, allowing pieces of Blackwood's mansion to live on in scattered fragments throughout the city. The land was divided into lots as planned, and houses were built. modest homes for middle-class families who likely gave little thought to what had once stood on the site they now occupied. Yet, the story of Blackwood's mansion did not end with its physical destruction. In the decades that followed, it became a cautionary tale, a story that was told and retold in different contexts and with different emphases depending on the teller and the times. In the immediate aftermath, it was cited as an example of the dangers of speculation and overextension, a warning to other industrialists not to let ambition exceed prudence. Later, during the Progressive Era, it became a symbol of the inequality and excess of the Gilded Age, evidence of a system that allowed individuals to accumulate obscene wealth while workers labored in poverty and dangerous conditions. Historians who studied the period found in Blackwood's story a microcosm of larger forces at work in American society during the late 19th century. His rise illustrated the opportunities created by industrialization and westward expansion, the way that a man with intelligence and ruthlessness could accumulate power and wealth on a scale that would have been impossible in earlier eras. His fall demonstrated the instability of the financial system that had made such accumulation possible, the way that networks of credit and speculation could collapse with catastrophic consequences when confidence evaporated. The mansion itself, even in its absence, continued to exert a strange fascination. Photographs of the building before its demolition circulated widely, appearing in books about architecture and the Gilded Age. These images showed a structure of undeniable grandeur, with its imposing facade, its countless windows reflecting the sky, its copper roof and stone chimneys rising above the surrounding landscape. Looking at these photographs, it was possible to understand why Blackwood had become obsessed with the project, why he had poured his fortune into creating something so magnificent. It was also possible to see how the mansion had become a trap, its beauty and ambition inseparable from the hubris and recklessness that had destroyed its creator. In 1923, a historian named Eleanor Chambers published a book titled The Railroad Barons, which included a substantial chapter on James Fitzgerald Blackwood. Chambers had spent years researching the period, interviewing people who had known Blackwood, and examining the documents that had been found in the mansion's ruins. Her portrait of Blackwood was complex, neither condemning him as a villain nor celebrating him as a visionary, but rather presenting him as a figure shaped by his time and circumstances, a man whose strengths and weaknesses were magnified by the scale on which he operated. Chambers argued that Blackwood's tragedy was not simply one of financial overextension but of a deeper psychological imbalance. She suggested that the mansion had represented something more than a display of wealth or power for Blackwood. It had become, in her interpretation, a physical manifestation of his identity, a structure that he needed to exist because without it he could not conceive of himself as the great man he believed he was or needed to be. The bankruptcy had not just destroyed his wealth but had annihilated his sense of self, leaving him a hollow man wandering the halls of a palace that no longer belonged to him. This psychological interpretation was controversial among Chambers' fellow historians, some of whom argued that she was reading too much into limited evidence and projecting modern psychoanalytic theories onto a historical figure who should be understood in the context of his own time. But her book was widely read, and her chapter on Blackwood influenced how subsequent generations understood his story. The mansion ceased to be simply a building and became a symbol, a metaphor for the costs of ambition and the emptiness that can lie at the heart of material success. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Blackwood's story found a new audience. In a time when many Americans were confronting the collapse of their own economic security, the tale of a railroad king brought low by his hubris had obvious resonance. Magazine articles and radio programs retold the story, often with embellishments that made it more dramatic and less historically accurate. In some versions, Blackwood was portrayed as a tragic hero, a man of vision destroyed by forces beyond his control. In others, he became a symbol of capitalist greed, a man who had exploited workers and manipulated markets and who had received his just punishment. The site where the mansion had stood was, by this time, thoroughly transformed. The houses that had been built on the subdivided land had themselves gone through cycles of ownership and renovation. Some had fallen into disrepair during the Depression, while others had been maintained and improved. There was nothing visible to indicate that the land had once held one of the most magnificent private residences in America. The only reminders were the occasional fragments of stone or metal that turned up when residents dug in their gardens, artifacts of a vanished grandeur that were usually discarded without recognition of what they had once been part of. Yet among local residents, particularly older ones who had heard stories from their parents and grandparents, there remained an awareness of the site's history. Some claimed that certain houses built on the former mansion grounds experienced unusual phenomena, doors that opened and closed on their own, cold spots that could not be explained by drafts, the sensation of being watched when alone. These stories were typically dismissed as folklore, the kind of legends that attach themselves to any place associated with tragedy or dramatic history. But they persisted, passed down through generations, adding a supernatural dimension to what was already a compelling story. In 1960, a developer proposed building a shopping center on land that included a portion of the former mansion site. This plan sparked renewed interest in Blackwood's story among local historians and preservationists. They launched a campaign to have the area designated as a historic site, arguing that even though the mansion no longer existed, the land itself had historical significance and should be protected from commercial development. The campaign was partially successful. The development was modified to exclude the area where the main house had stood, and a small park was created that included a historical marker explaining the site's significance. The marker, a bronze plaque mounted on a granite post, provided a brief summary of Blackwood's life and the mansion's history. It was written in the neutral language typical of such markers, presenting facts without judgment: the dates of construction, the cost, the circumstances of the bankruptcy, the year of demolition. Visitors to the park could stand on what had once been the site of the grand entrance hall, imagining the marble staircase and frescoed ceilings that had once existed in the space now occupied by grass and trees, trying to conjure from historical descriptions a vision of what had been lost. The marker also noted, in its final sentence, that James Fitzgerald Blackwood had died on the property in 1870. It did not mention the circumstances of his death or his repeated trespassing on the property he had lost, details that would have complicated the simple narrative that the marker was meant to convey. But for those who knew the fuller story, this fact added a layer of pathos to the site. Blackwood had returned to his mansion in death as he had in life during his final years, unable to let go of the place that had destroyed him. Academic interest in Blackwood and his mansion experienced a revival in the 1980s and 90s as historians of the Gilded Age sought to understand the period with greater nuance and complexity. Several doctoral dissertations examined aspects of Blackwood's business practices, his role in railroad development, and the social and cultural significance of the mansion. One particularly detailed study, published in 1992, analyzed the architectural plans for the mansion and compared them to other great houses of the period, arguing that Black residence represented the apogee of a particular, the style of American domestic architecture that combined European influences with distinctly American elements of scale and technological innovation. This architectural study made extensive use of the original plans by Auguste Durand, which had survived in the archives of the architectural firm that had inherited Durand's practice after his death. The plans revealed details that had not been widely known, including features of the mansion that had never been completed or that had been modified during construction. There were, for example, plans for an observatory tower that would have added another story to the structure, giving it an even more dramatic silhouette. There were designs for a conservatory that would have contained tropical plants, creating a permanent summer within glass walls even during the harsh Hudson Valley winters. These unrealized elements added another dimension to the tragedy, suggesting that even the magnificent structure that Blackwood had built was incomplete, a fragment of an even grander vision that had exceeded the capacity of even his vast resources to realize. The study also examined the costs of the mansion in detail, breaking down expenditures by category and comparing them to typical construction costs of the period. This analysis confirmed what had long been suspected. Blackwood had paid vastly more than necessary for many elements of the mansion, sometimes 2 or 3 times the market rate. This was partly due to the custom nature of much of the work and the use of expensive materials, but it also reflected what the study termed a lack of financial discipline. Blackwood had apparently not maintained careful oversight of expenditures, trusting contractors and craftsmen to charge fair prices and failing to implement the kind of cost controls that he would have demanded in his business ventures. It was as if the mansion existed in a separate mental category for Blackwood, exempt from the rationality and calculation that characterized his other endeavors. The human cost of the mansion's construction received less attention in historical studies until relatively recently. For decades, the focus had been on Blackwood himself, on the architecture, on the financial aspects of the story. But beginning in the late 1990s and continuing into the 21st century, historians began to ask different questions. Who were the workers who built the mansion? What were their lives like? How were they affected by the project and its ultimate failure? Research into these questions proved difficult because records of individual workers were sparse. Construction companies of the period did not maintain detailed employment records, and workers, many of whom were immigrants with limited literacy, left few personal accounts. But by piecing together fragments from various sources, including local newspaper articles, church records, and scattered letters and diaries, historians were able to reconstruct something of the workers' experience. The picture that emerged was grim. Workers on the mansion project labored 6 days a week, from dawn until dusk in summer, and for as long as light permitted in winter. They were paid by the day, with skilled craftsmen earning perhaps $3 or $4 while common laborers received less than $2. Housing was provided in rough barracks on the property, overcrowded structures where men slept in bunks stacked 3 high. Food was basic and often insufficient, leading some workers to spend their meager wages on additional provisions. Accidents were common and often serious. The construction of such a large and complex structure involved inherently dangerous work. Men fell from scaffolding, were struck by falling materials, suffered crushing injuries from machinery and heavy stones, The records that do exist document dozens of injuries and at least 17 deaths during the construction period. These deaths were treated as routine business expenses, with families of deceased workers receiving small payments, if anything, in compensation for their loss. One particularly well-documented case involved a young Italian stonemason named Giovanni Rossi, who had been brought from Florence specifically to work on the mansion's marble elements. Rossi was only 23 years old, recently married, with a pregnant wife waiting for him in Italy. He had signed a contract to work on the mansion for 2 years, attracted by wages that were far higher than what he could earn in his homeland. 6 months into his contract, while working on the installation of the grand staircase, a pulley system failed and a massive slab of marble fell on him, crushing his legs. He died 3 days later from his injuries, in agony. In the workers' infirmary that had been set up on the property, Rossi's death became known because his widow, upon learning of the tragedy, wrote letters to American authorities demanding compensation and the return of her husband's body. The letters, written in Italian and translated by a priest, were passionate and heartbreaking, describing her desperate financial situation and her grief at losing her husband so far from home. The construction company that had employed Rossi offered her $100 in settlement, a sum that she eventually accepted because she had no choice. Rossi was buried in a local cemetery, far from the homeland he had planned to return to with money saved from his work on the mansion. His grave marker, paid for by his fellow workers, identified him only by name and the year of his death. It made no mention of the mansion or the circumstances that had brought him to America. Stories like Rossi's were repeated many times over during the mansion's construction. Each death, each injury, was a small tragedy that rippled outward, affecting families and communities in ways that were never calculated in the mansion's cost. When Blackwood went bankrupt and the mansion stood empty, these workers received nothing for their sacrifice. The wages they were owed became just another line item in the bankruptcy proceedings, claims that would never be fully paid. Some workers lost weeks or months of pay, money they had counted on to support their families or send back to relatives in their home countries. The broader economic impact of the mansion on the local region was similarly complex and ultimately harmful. During the construction period, the project had brought prosperity to the area. Local businesses had benefited from the influx of workers who needed food, clothing, and other goods. Farmers sold produce to feed the construction crews. Merchants stocked items that workers wanted to purchase with their wages. The railroad spur built to serve the construction site also provided improved transportation for local residents. But this prosperity was artificial, dependent entirely on the continuation of the construction project. When Blackwood's bankruptcy halted work on the mansion, the economic benefits evaporated almost overnight. Workers left the area in search of employment elsewhere. The businesses that had expanded to serve them found themselves overextended, with excess inventory and capacity they could not sustain. Several local merchants went bankrupt themselves, victims of the same financial collapse that had destroyed Blackwood. The community that had grown up around the mansion site, a small settlement that workers had named Blackwood in honor of their employer, essentially died with the project. By 1880, after the mansion's demolition, only a few scattered houses remained, occupied by families too poor to move elsewhere. The name Blackwood itself was abandoned, and maps of the area reverted to using the older name for the locality. It was as if the community leaders wanted to erase any association with the failed mansion and the man who had built it. Among those most severely affected by the mansion's collapse were the craftsmen and artists who had invested not just their labor but their creative reputations in the project. For many of them, the commission to work on Blackwood's mansion had represented the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to create something extraordinary that would enhance their standing in their professions. The fresco painter who had worked on the library ceiling had turned down other commissions to focus exclusively on the mansion, confident that the prestige of the project would lead to future opportunities. Instead, when the mansion was abandoned and then demolished, his work was destroyed, and he found himself associated with a notorious failure. His career never recovered, and he died in poverty in 1889, his talent largely forgotten. Auguste Durand, the architect, survived professionally but was deeply affected by the mansion's fate. He returned to France after Blackwood's bankruptcy, and while he continued to practice architecture, he never again attempted a project of comparable ambition. In his later years, he spoke rarely of the mansion, and when he did, it was with a mixture of pride and regret. He had created what he believed was his masterpiece, a building that combined beauty and innovation in ways that he would never surpass. But that masterpiece had existed for only a few years before being destroyed, leaving him to wonder whether it had ever been more than a magnificent folly. In the archives of Durand's firm, researchers later found a series of sketches he had made of the mansion years after its demolition. These were not architectural drawings but rather impressionistic renderings, images of the building shrouded in shadow or engulfed in flames, or being reclaimed by nature, vines growing through broken windows and trees pushing through the roof. These sketches suggested that Durand had been haunted by the mansion's destruction, processing his feelings about the project through art that was never intended for public viewing. They revealed a man grappling with a question that every artist must confront. What does it mean to create something beautiful that is destroyed before its purpose can be fulfilled? The question of purpose was central to understanding the mansion and its place in Blackwood's life. On the surface, the purpose seemed obvious. It was to be a residence, a place where Blackwood would live and entertain and establish himself as a figure of cultural and social importance to match his economic power. But as historians examined the evidence more closely, this explanation seemed insufficient. Blackwood had barely lived in the mansion, even during the period when construction was substantially complete and parts of the building were furnished and habitable. He had spent only a handful of nights there. He had hosted no grand parties, entertained no presidents, realized none of the social ambitions that had presumably motivated the project. Instead, the mansion seemed to have been important to Blackwood primarily as a symbol, as a physical embodiment of his achievements and ambitions. The act of building it was more significant than the act of living in it. This interpretation was supported by accounts from people who had known Blackwood during the construction period. They described him as being more interested in the process of creation than in the finished product, more excited by solving engineering challenges and acquiring rare materials than by the prospect of actually using the spaces being created. It was as if the mansion was a kind of scorecard, a way of keeping track of just how successful he had become, with each additional room and each extravagant detail serving as proof of his ascendancy. This understanding of the mansion's purpose made Blackwood's bankruptcy and the loss of the property even more psychologically devastating than a simple financial setback would have been. The mansion was not just an asset he had lost, but a physical representation of his identity and worth. When it was taken from him, he lost not just a building but the very foundation of his sense of self. His inability to let go of the property, his compulsion to return to it even after it no longer belonged to him, who reflected a deeper need to maintain contact with this physical manifestation of who he believed himself to be. This psychological dimension of the story made it particularly compelling to audiences in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a period when questions of identity, materialism, and the meaning of success were being widely debated. Blackwood's story became a parable for the dangers of defining oneself through material accumulation, of building an identity on a foundation as fragile as economic circumstance. The mansion, in this reading, was a trap that Blackwood had built for himself, a beautiful prison that had destroyed him, even as he poured his life into creating it. The discovery of Blackwood's personal papers, which had been stored in a trunk in his daughter's attic and donated to a university archive in 1958, added new dimensions to this understanding. The papers included business correspondence, personal letters, and most significantly, a journal that Blackwood had kept intermittently during the final years of his life. The journal was not a systematic record but rather a collection of fragmentary entries, some running 4 pages, others consisting of just a few lines. Many entries dealt with mundane matters, accounts of meetings, notes about business deals, observations about people he had encountered. But interspersed among these routine notations were passages of startling emotional intensity, revealing a man in profound psychological distress. In one entry from February 1870, Blackwood wrote about a dream he had experienced. In the dream, he was in the mansion, walking through its endless rooms, searching for something he could not name. Each room he entered was more magnificent than the last, filled with treasures and beautiful objects, but he felt no pleasure in seeing them. Instead, he felt increasingly desperate, certain that what he was searching for was in the next room, only to find when he entered that room that it too was empty of what he sought, despite being filled with valuable things. The dream ended with him standing in the ballroom, surrounded by mirrors that reflected his image infinitely in all directions, and realizing that he was utterly alone. Blackwood's interpretation of this dream, recorded in the same journal entry, was that it represented his fear of death and meaninglessness. He had built an empire and a palace, but what would remain when he was gone? His railroads would be sold and absorbed by competitors. His wealth would be dispersed among creditors and heirs. The mansion, if it survived at all, would belong to strangers who would have no connection to him, no understanding of what it represented. He would be forgotten, or worse, remembered only as a cautionary tale, a man who had reached too far and fallen. The thought filled him with a despair that he struggled to articulate, describing it as a hollow feeling in his chest, as if his heart had been replaced with empty space. These journal entries were deeply affecting to read, revealing as they did the inner life of a man who had seemed to his contemporaries to be supremely confident and self-assured. They showed Blackwood as a profoundly unhappy person, driven by insecurities and fears that his public persona concealed. The mansion, in this context, appeared less as an expression of joy or triumph than as a desperate attempt to create something permanent, something that would outlast him and prove that his life had mattered. The irony, of course, was that the mansion had not outlasted him, at least not in the way he had intended. It had been demolished just 3 years after his death, reduced to rubble and sold for salvage. But in another sense, the mansion had achieved a kind of immortality that Blackwood could not have anticipated. Through photographs, architectural plans, historical accounts, and the story of its creation and destruction, the mansion lived on in cultural memory. becoming more famous in its absence than it might have been had it survived. People who knew nothing else about the Gilded Age often knew about Blackwood's mansion, recognizing it as a symbol of an era's excesses and contradictions. The mansion's influence extended beyond history into popular culture. It appeared thinly disguised in novels and films about the Gilded Age. Writers used it as a setting for ghost stories, imagining the spirits of Blackwood and the workers who had died building it wandering the ruins. It inspired artists who created paintings and illustrations imagining the mansion in its glory or its decay. In the 21st century, it became the subject of a video game in which players explored a virtual reconstruction of the mansion, solving puzzles and uncovering the story of its creation and destruction. This cultural afterlife raised interesting questions about memory and loss. The physical mansion was gone, destroyed so thoroughly that even its exact footprint on the land was uncertain. Yet in some ways, the mansion existed more vividly in imagination than it ever had in reality. The photographs that survived showed only fragments, external views and a few interior shots taken before Blackwood's bankruptcy. The rest had to be reconstructed from architectural plans and written descriptions, a process that inevitably involved interpretation and imagination. Different historians and artists created different versions of the mansion in their work, each emphasizing different aspects and making different choices about how to fill in the gaps in the historical record. The result was that there were, in a sense, many mansions, each a variation on a theme, some closer to what had actually existed and others drifting further into fiction. This multiplicity of mansions seemed appropriate given the nature of the building itself. The mansion had always been as much an idea as a physical structure, a concept that exceeded any single material realization. Blackwood had died before it was truly finished, and it had been demolished while still incomplete. It had never achieved the definitive form that its creator had envisioned. Perhaps it was fitting, then, that it should continue to exist in multiple, incomplete forms, each telling a slightly different story about ambition, failure, and the relationship between material wealth and human meaning. The academic study of the mansion and its creator continued to evolve as new methodologies and perspectives emerged in historical research. In the early 21st century, scholars began to apply economic analysis to Blackwood's business empire, using tools developed for understanding modern financial markets to examine the structure of his railroad companies and the mechanisms of his bankruptcy. This research revealed that Blackwood's collapse had been even more complex than previously understood, involving interconnected networks of holding companies, bond issues, and stock manipulations that would have been considered sophisticated even by contemporary standards. One particularly revealing study, published in 2008, analyzed the flow of money through Blackwood's corporate empire in the years leading up to his bankruptcy. Using accounting records that had survived in various archives, the researchers traced how funds from his profitable railroad operations were diverted to finance the construction of new lines, acquisitions of competitors, and ultimately the building of the mansion. They found evidence of what they termed a Ponzi-like structure, in which Blackwood was using revenues from established operations to pay the costs of expansion and to service debts from earlier ventures, creating an arrangement that was sustainable only as long as the overall enterprise continued to grow. When the Panic of 1873 struck and growth stopped, this structure collapsed with devastating speed. The researchers estimated that at the moment of his bankruptcy, Blackwood's total debts exceeded his assets by more than $15 million, an enormous sum for the period. But what was particularly striking was how much of this debt was directly or indirectly related to the mansion. Even setting aside the $7 million spent on construction, the mansion had played a role in the collapse by serving as collateral for loans that Blackwood had taken out to finance his railroad expansion. When he defaulted on these loans, the creditors had seized the mansion, creating a cascade of consequences that accelerated the unraveling of his entire empire. This research suggested that the common understanding of the mansion as a vanity project that bankrupted Blackwood was both true and incomplete. Yes, the mansion had consumed resources that might have been used to strengthen his business operations, but the business operations themselves were unstable, built on assumptions about continued growth and access to credit that the Panic of 1873 revealed to be unfounded. In a sense, the mansion and the business empire suffered from the same fundamental problem. They were both expressions of an ambition that exceeded any sustainable foundation, structures built on optimism and credit, rather than on solid ground. The human dimension of Black business practices received new attention in the early 21st century as labor historians examined the conditions in which his railroad workers had operated. The men who built and maintained Blackwood's railroads had worked under conditions that were often appalling even by the standards of the 19th century. Railroad construction in the American West was brutal work, involving long hours in extreme weather, dangerous tasks with primitive equipment, and minimal safety precautions. Workers were crushed between cars, fell from trestles, died in explosions and landslides and accidents of every description. Blackwood's railroads had safety records that were poor even by the lax standards of the industry. An analysis of accident reports from the period showed that his lines experienced higher rates of worker fatalities and injuries than comparable railroads. This was attributed to several factors. Blackwood's focus on rapid expansion meant that construction was often rushed, with insufficient attention to safety. His cost-cutting measures reduced spending on equipment maintenance and safety equipment, and his management philosophy emphasized efficiency and productivity over worker welfare. One particularly well-documented incident occurred in 1871, when a crew working on a tunnel through the Sierra Nevada was killed by an explosion of nitroglycerin, an unstable explosive that was commonly used in railroad construction despite its extreme danger. 18 men died in the blast, which was so powerful that some of the bodies were never recovered. The incident was investigated by local authorities, who found that the nitroglycerin had been stored improperly and handled by workers who had received inadequate training. They recommended safety improvements and greater oversight of dangerous materials. Blackwood's company contested these findings, arguing that the accident was the result of worker error rather than corporate negligence. They made small payments to the families of the dead men, amounts calculated to avoid legal liability rather than to provide genuine compensation. The incident received coverage in regional newspapers but was soon forgotten as other news displaced it. It was one of hundreds of similar tragedies that occurred during the construction of America's railroads, individual stories that were lost in the larger narrative of progress and development. But these stories mattered, and historians working more than a century later labored to recover them, to give names and faces to the thousands of workers whose labor had built Blackwood's empire and whose suffering had been treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. Each recovered story added weight to the moral dimension of Blackwood's legacy. He had not simply built a railroad empire, he had built it on the backs of workers whose lives were cheap and whose deaths were mere statistical entries in corporate ledgers. The mansion, constructed simultaneously with his most intensive period of railroad expansion, it stood as a monument not just to his ambition but to the human cost of that ambition, Blackwood's family. History added another layer of complexity to his story. His marriage to Catherine Winslow in 1855 had produced 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Catherine came from a wealthy Boston family and brought substantial financial resources to the marriage, funds that Blackwood had used in his early business ventures. By all accounts, the marriage had been happy in its early years, with Catherine supporting her husband's ambitions and managing the household while he focused on building his business empire. But the relationship had deteriorated as Blackwood became increasingly obsessed with his railroad ventures and, eventually, with the mansion. Catherine had never shared her husband's enthusiasm for the mansion project. She had argued that it was unnecessary, that they already had a comfortable home in New York where they were established in society, that the money would be better spent on their children's futures or on charitable endeavors. Her objections had been overruled, and she had watched with growing alarm as her husband poured the family's resources into what she considered a monument to his vanity. The strain on the marriage became acute during the construction period. Blackwood was frequently absent, either traveling to inspect his railroad operations or visiting the mansion construction site. When he was home, he was preoccupied, his conversation dominated by details of the mansion's construction. Catherine found herself essentially a widow to a living husband, managing a household and raising children with minimal involvement from her spouse. Her letters to her sister during this period, preserved in family papers, revealed a woman who felt isolated, ignored, and increasingly resentful of the project that had consumed her husband's attention and their family's wealth. When Blackwood's business empire collapsed in 1873, Catherine made a decision that shocked her social circle. She separated from her husband, taking their 3 children and moving to Philadelphia to live with relatives. In the 19th century, formal separation was scandalous, particularly for a woman of Catherine's social standing. It implied failure, desperation, and a violation of social norms regarding a wife's duty to support her husband in adversity. But Catherine was apparently beyond caring about such considerations. Her husband had destroyed their financial security through recklessness and obsession. She would not allow him to destroy their children's futures as well. The separation was bitter. Blackwood contested it, arguing that Catherine had no right to take the children from him. Legal proceedings dragged on for months before a settlement was reached that allowed Catherine to retain custody of the children in exchange for limited financial support from Blackwood, who by this point had little to offer anyway. The settlement also stipulated that Blackwood would have no claim on any property or inheritance that might come to Catherine from her own family, a provision that protected her from his creditors. The separation devastated Blackwood. His journal entries from this period revealed a man who felt utterly alone, abandoned by his wife at the moment of his greatest need. He wrote bitter passages about Catherine's lack of loyalty, accusing her of deserting him when she should have stood by him. But interspersed with these accusations were admissions of guilt and self-recrimination. He acknowledged that he had neglected his family, that he had prioritized his ambitions over their well-being, that he had destroyed their lives through his obsessive pursuit of a dream that had proven to be hollow. Catherine's death in 1876 from pneumonia, at the age of 46, was another blow to Blackwood. Despite their separation, He had apparently harbored hopes of reconciliation, believing that once his financial situation improved, he might be able to rebuild the relationship. Her death made this impossible, leaving him with only regret and the knowledge that he had squandered what might have been the most important relationship in his life for the sake of business ventures and a mansion that no longer belonged to him. The children's fates varied, but were all affected by their father's disgrace. The eldest daughter, Margaret, married a lawyer from a respectable Philadelphia family and lived a quiet life. Apparently determined to distance herself from her father's scandal, she refused to see Blackwood after her mother's death, and when he attempted to contact her, she returned his letters unopened. She died in 1918, having lived long enough to see the 20th century but never having reconciled with her father or his memory. The younger daughter, Elizabeth, took a different path. She had been closer to her father than her sister, and after Catherine's death, she attempted to maintain some relationship with Blackwood. She visited him occasionally in his rented rooms in New York, bringing food and attempting to provide some comfort to a man who seemed to be slowly disintegrating. Her letters from this period, addressed to her sister and preserved in family archives, described Blackwood as a broken man, physically frail and mentally unstable. "I'm obsessed with the mansion and his lost empire to the point where he could barely maintain a conversation about any other topic." Elizabeth's married in 1880, 3 years after her father's death, to a college professor who taught classical literature at a small college in upstate New York. She seemed to have found happiness in this modest life, far removed from the grandeur and trauma of her childhood. In her later years, she wrote a memoir that was never published but which survived in manuscript form. In it, she reflected on her father and his legacy, attempting to understand the man who had built so much and destroyed so much, including his own family. Her portrait of Blackwood was sympathetic but not uncritical, recognizing his intelligence and vision while also acknowledging the human cost of his ambitions. The son, James Fitzgerald Blackwood Jr., had the most difficult path of all. He was only 15 when his father's empire collapsed, at an age where identity and self-worth were still forming. The experience of watching his father fall from heights of power and respect to bankruptcy and disgrace left deep psychological scars. He struggled academically, was expelled from 2 schools for disciplinary problems, and as a young adult showed signs of the alcoholism that would plague him throughout his life. Jr. made several attempts to establish himself in business, using connections from his mother's family to secure positions in various firms, but he could not escape his father's shadow. Potential employers and business associates were always aware of who he was, and the association with James Fitzgerald Blackwood Sr. was as often a liability as an advantage. Some saw him as potentially carrying the same reckless tendencies that had destroyed his father. Others simply wanted nothing to do with a name that had become synonymous with failure and scandal. By his 30s, Jr. had essentially given up on achieving success in the conventional sense. He lived on a small income from a trust that Catherine's family had established for the children, spending his days in clubs and saloons, drinking away his inheritance and his potential. He died in 1905, at the age of 47, of cirrhosis of the liver. He never married, left no children, and was buried in an unmarked grave. The Blackwood name ending with him, the trajectory of Blackwood's children, illustrated another dimension of the mansion's cost. The destruction of their father's empire and the scandal that surrounded it had ripple effects that extended across generations, damaging lives in ways that were not immediately apparent. The children bore no responsibility for their father's decisions, yet they paid a price for them, their lives shaped by circumstances they had not created and could not control. The mansion, in this sense, consumed not just money and labor but futures, possibilities, entire life paths that might have been different had Blackwood exercised more restraint in his ambitions. The broader social impact of Blackwood's collapse also deserves examination. His bankruptcy did not occur in isolation but was part of the larger financial panic of 1873, which triggered an economic depression that lasted for 6 years. Thousands of businesses failed, millions of workers lost their jobs, and the entire nation struggled with economic hardship. Blackwood was not responsible for the panic. He was a victim of it, but his collapse contributed to the severity of the crisis, particularly in the financial sector. The banks and financial institutions that had lent to Blackwood, that held bonds in his railroad companies, that had accepted his assets as collateral, all suffered significant losses when he went bankrupt. Several smaller banks failed entirely, unable to absorb the losses from their Blackwood-related investments. These bank failures, in turn, affected depositors who lost their savings, businesses that lost their credit, and communities that lost access to financial services. The interconnected nature of the financial system meant that Blackwood's collapse sent shockwaves through the economy, affecting people who had never heard his name and had no direct connection to his enterprises. One particularly poignant example was discovered by researchers examining the records of a small bank in Ohio that failed in late 1873. The bank had invested heavily in bonds issued by one of Blackwood's railroad companies, attracted by the high interest rates and the company's apparent financial strength. When Blackwood defaulted on these bonds, the value of the bank's holdings collapsed, leaving it insolvent. The bank's closure wiped out the savings of hundreds of depositors, including farmers who had deposited their earnings from the harvest season, intending to use the money to sustain them through the winter. Court records from the bankruptcy proceedings documented cases of individual depositors who lost everything. One farmer testified that he had deposited $1,200, the proceeds from selling his wheat crop, just weeks before the bank failed. He lost all of it. With no savings, he was unable to purchase seed for the next planting season, could not pay his mortgage, and was eventually forced to sell his farm at a distressed price. He ended up working as a hired laborer on land he had once owned. His life transformed from independence to dependency by financial forces he could not understand or control. The chain of causation that connected this farmer's ruin to Blackwood's mansion was long and complex, but it was real. Multiply this story by thousands, by tens of thousands, and you begin to understand the human dimension of financial panics and the systemic nature of economic catastrophe. Blackwood's mansion was not just a building project that went wrong. It was a node in a network of economic relationships, and when it failed, the failure propagated through that network like a disease, infecting everyone connected to it. The legal aftermath of Blackwood's bankruptcy was extraordinarily complex, involving hundreds of creditors, multiple jurisdictions, and assets scattered across the nation. The proceedings dragged on for more than a decade, consuming additional resources in legal fees and administrative costs. Teams of lawyers worked full-time untangling the corporate structures Blackwood had created, trying to determine which entities owned what assets and who had priority claims on those assets. The complexity was intentional in some respects. Blackwood had structured his empire to obscure the true relationships between different components, making it difficult for creditors to seize assets or for regulators to understand the overall financial picture. One of the bankruptcy's revelations was the extent to which Blackwood had borrowed from one company to pay another, creating circular patterns of debt that had no real backing. He would issue bonds through Railroad Company A, use the proceeds to purchase stock in Railroad Company B, then have Railroad Company B issue its own bonds to pay dividends to Railroad Company A's stockholders, including himself. On paper, this created the appearance of profitable, well-capitalized companies generating real returns. In reality, it was an elaborate shell game, moving money in circles to create an illusion of value. When this structure collapsed, the lawyers and judges trying to sort out the bankruptcy found themselves confronting a situation that had few precedents. Normal bankruptcy procedures assumed that a company's assets could be identified, valued, and distributed to creditors in an orderly fashion. But Blackwood's empire was so interconnected and so deliberately obscured that even basic questions like what assets exist and who owns them were subject to dispute. Multiple creditors would claim the same assets, each with legal arguments supporting their claim. Resolving these disputes required years of litigation. The mansion itself became one of the most contentious assets in the bankruptcy. Multiple parties claimed ownership or security interests in the property. There were the original construction loans that Blackwood had taken to finance the building. There were later loans where he had used the mansion as collateral. There were claims from contractors and suppliers who had not been fully paid for their work and materials. There were even claims from some of Blackwood's railroad bond who argued that the mansion should be considered an asset of the railroad companies and therefore available to satisfy their claims. The courts eventually sorted through these competing claims and awarded the mansion to a consortium of the major lenders who held the first mortgages. But the legal process took nearly 3 years, during which time the mansion sat empty, deteriorating from neglect and vulnerable to theft and vandalism. By the time the ownership question was finally resolved, the property was in significantly worse condition than when Blackwood had lost it, reducing its value and making it even harder to sell. The difficulty in selling the mansion revealed a fundamental problem with such grand estate properties. They were expensive to maintain, requiring large staffs and constant upkeep. They weren't practical for most purposes, too large for a family residence and poorly suited for institutional uses. And they represented a concentration of capital that was difficult to liquidate. Finding a buyer who both wanted such a property and could afford it was challenging in the best of times. In the midst of an economic depression, it was nearly impossible. The banks that owned the mansion tried various strategies to dispose of it. They attempted to sell it at auction but received no acceptable bids. They approached wealthy individuals directly, offering favorable terms, but found no takers. They even considered converting it to a hotel or resort, but feasibility studies showed that the costs of such a conversion would be prohibitive, and that the location was not ideal for attracting guests. Eventually, they were forced to accept the developer's low offer simply to be rid of the property and recover some fraction of their investment. The sale of the mansion for $250,000, compared to the $7 million Blackwood had spent building it, represented a destruction of wealth that was staggering even in the context of the broader economic collapse. The difference between those figures did not simply disappear into thin air. It represented labor performed, materials consumed, services rendered, all of which had created value at the time but which had been destroyed by the building's premature demolition. The workers who built the mansion had expended effort that produced something real, but the fruits of that effort were erased, leaving nothing behind except memories and fragments. This destruction of value extended beyond the physical property to include all the secondary investments and expenditures associated with it. Olmsted's landscape designs, representing years of work and artistic vision, were obliterated when the grounds were subdivided and developed. The custom furniture and fixtures, many of which were works of art in themselves, were scattered and lost, sold for pennies on the dollar or simply discarded. The systems and technologies that had been installed at great expense, innovations that represented the cutting edge of their field, were ripped out and scrapped for salvage value. Future generations would look back on this destruction with a mixture of horror and how could a society allow such waste? How could something so valuable be simply erased? But these questions assumed a degree of social coordination and long-term thinking that did not exist in the chaotic aftermath of Blackwood's bankruptcy. The various parties involved in the disposal of the mansion were each acting rationally from their individual perspectives. The banks wanted to minimize their losses. The developer wanted to maximize his profit. The buyers of the subdivided lots wanted affordable housing. No one had either the incentive or the authority to preserve the mansion for its cultural or historical value. The market had spoken, and the market said that the mansion was worth more as rubble than as architecture. The impact of the mansion's construction and destruction received little attention at the time but has to become a topic of interest for contemporary historians, examining the ecological costs of Gilded Age development. The quarrying of limestone for the mansion's construction created permanent scars in the landscape, pits and disrupted geology that remain visible today. The diversion of streams for Olmsted's water features altered local hydrology, affecting wetlands and aquatic ecosystems. The construction process itself generated enormous amounts of waste, from excess stone and timber to the detritus of the workers' settlement, all of which was simply left on the land or dumped into the river. The mansion's brief existence saw the consumption of resources at a prodigious rate. Heating the enormous structure during winter required tons of coal, contributing to air pollution in the local area. The power plant that generated electricity for the mansion burned coal as well, adding to the environmental burden. The maintenance of the extensive grounds required large quantities of water, fertilizers, and pesticides, all of which had impacts on local soil and water quality. For the few years that the mansion operated, even partially, it functioned as a node of intense resource consumption, extracting value from the environment and returning waste. The demolition reversed this process in a destructive way. The building materials, rather than being carefully salvaged and reused, were largely reduced to rubble. Some materials, like the marble and decorative metalwork, were saved and found new uses. But the majority, including the millions of bricks and thousands of cubic feet of limestone, were simply broken up and used as fill or disposed of in ways that offered no benefit. The demolition process itself created pollution, from the dust and particulates released when the building was destroyed to the contamination from lead paint and other materials that were not considered hazardous at the time but which we now understand pose environmental and health risks. From an ecological perspective, the entire cycle of the mansion's construction, brief use, and demolition represented a massive inefficiency, a conversion of natural resources into waste products with minimal value created in between. This pattern was not unique to Blackwood's mansion but was characteristic of much Gilded Age development, which prioritized short-term economic gain over long-term sustainability or environmental stewardship. The mansion was simply a particularly dramatic example of this broader pattern, its scale and rapid destruction making visible processes that were occurring throughout the industrializing American economy. The cultural memory of the mansion has evolved significantly over the decades since its destruction. Immediately after the demolition, there was a tendency to view the entire episode as best forgotten, an embarrassing chapter in local and national history that reflected poorly on everyone involved. Blackwood was regarded as a cautionary tale at best and a villain at worst. The mansion was seen as a monument to greed and excess, and its destruction was viewed as appropriate if not actively satisfying, a kind of rough justice for Blackwood's crimes of ambition. But as time passed and the immediate pain of the bankruptcy and depression faded, attitudes began to shift. By the early 20th century, there was a growing nostalgia for the Gilded Age, a sense that, despite its problems, it had been an era of vitality and possibility that the more regulated, bureaucratic world of the early 1900s lacked. In this context, Blackwood began to be re-evaluated. While few defended his business practices or his neglect of his family, there was increasing appreciation for his vision and his willingness to attempt something extraordinary, even if that attempt had ended in failure. The mansion, in this revisionist view, was not simply a monument to excess but also a work of art and engineering that represented the aspirations of its age. The fact that it had been destroyed came to be seen not as justice but as tragedy, a loss of something that could never be recreated. Preservationists pointed to the mansion as an example of why historic buildings needed protection, arguing that architectural heritage should not be left entirely to market forces. The mansion's fate influenced the historic preservation movement in America, serving as a cautionary example of what could be lost when economic considerations were the only factors in decision-making about significant buildings. This shift in perspective was gradual and never complete. Throughout the 20th century, Blackwood and his mansion remained contested symbols, interpreted differently depending on one's perspective on capitalism, inequality, historic preservation, and American history more broadly. For some, the mansion remained primarily a symbol of Gilded Age excess, a reminder of a period when wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few who used it to build monuments to themselves while workers labored in poverty. For others, it was a lost masterpiece, a building that should have been preserved and which might have become a national treasure if it had survived. The debate over how to remember and interpret the mansion intensified in the late 20th and early 20th centuries as income inequality in America reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The parallels between Blackwood's time and the contemporary era were hard to ignore. Once again, enormous fortunes were being made through technological innovation and financial manipulation. Once again, the wealthy were building grand estates and accumulating luxuries on a scale that seemed obscene to many observers. Once again, there were concerns about the stability of the financial system and the sustainability of an economic model that created such extreme disparities in wealth and power. In this context, Blackwood's story took on new relevance. He became a figure through which contemporary observers could explore questions about wealth, ambition, responsibility, and the costs of extreme inequality. Books and articles about the mansion appeared with increasing frequency, each offering new interpretations or focusing on different aspects of the story. Documentary filmmakers created treatments of Blackwood's rise and fall, using historical photographs and dramatic reenactments to bring the story to life for contemporary audiences. The mansion became a cultural touchstone, a reference point in debates about economic policy and social priorities. One particularly influential interpretation came from a 2012 book by economist and historian David Morrison titled The Cost of Grandeur: American Mansions in Economic Collapse. Morrison used Blackwood's mansion as a central case study in his examination of how extreme wealth concentration can create economic instability. He argued that Blackwood's ability to divert enormous resources to building a personal residence was a symptom of an economic system that allowed too much capital to accumulate in too few hands, creating both moral problems and systemic financial risks. Morrison's analysis showed that the $7 million Blackwood spent on the mansion represented approximately $175 million in 2012 values, a sum that could have built hundreds of affordable homes or funded substantial public infrastructure. The concentration of this much wealth in a single vanity project represented a misallocation of resources that occurred because Blackwood faced no constraints on his accumulation or spending. His bankruptcy, Morrison argued, was not simply a personal failure but a systemic failure, evidence that the financial and regulatory systems of the Gilded Age were inadequate to prevent destructive behavior by the wealthy and powerful. This economic analysis was compelling to many readers but controversial among historians, who felt it imposed contemporary values on historical subjects in ways that were not entirely fair. They pointed out that judging Blackwood by modern standards of corporate responsibility and economic ethics was anachronistic, that he had operated within the norms and legal framework of his own time, however inadequate those might appear in retrospect. The debate over how to evaluate historical figures in general, and Blackwood in particular, continued, with no clear resolution. What was clear, however, was that Blackwood's mansion had transcended its physical existence to become a symbol, whose meaning could shift and evolve depending on the concerns and perspectives of those interpreting it. The building itself was gone, but the story of the building lived on, continually being retold and reinterpreted, each generation finding in it reflections of their own anxieties and aspirations. In 2018, a team of architects and digital artists created a virtual reality reconstruction of the mansion based on Duran's architectural plans and historical photographs. The project took 3 years and involved painstaking research to ensure historical accuracy in every detail, from the proportions of rooms to the patterns of wallpaper to the view from each window. The result was an immersive experience that allowed users to walk through the mansion as it might have appeared in 8, exploring its rooms and appreciating its grandeur in a way that had been impossible for more than a century. The virtual mansion was a revelation. For the first time since the building's destruction, it was possible to truly appreciate the scale and beauty of what Blackwood had created. The virtual tour began in the grand entrance hall, with its soaring ceiling and marble staircase rising in elegant curves to the upper floors. Moving through the rooms, visitors encountered the library with its frescoed ceiling, the ballroom with its intricate wooden floor and crystal chandelier, the dining room with its long table and ornate furnishings, the indoor swimming pool with its hand-painted Portuguese tiles. Each room was a showcase of craftsmanship and design, and experiencing them in sequence created a cumulative effect that was overwhelming. The mansion was not just large but beautiful, not just expensive but artistically significant. The virtual reconstruction made clear what photographs could only hint at. This had been a masterpiece of architecture, a building that combined French elegance with American scale and technological innovation to create something genuinely new and remarkable. The emotional impact of the virtual mansion was powerful and complex. Visitors felt awe at the beauty of the spaces, sadness at the knowledge that this extraordinary building had been destroyed, and uncomfortable awareness of the human cost that its construction had entailed. The experience forced a confrontation with difficult questions. Was it possible to appreciate the beauty of the mansion while condemning the system that had made its construction possible? Could one mourn the loss of a building while recognizing that its creator had been, in many ways, a destructive force? How should we remember achievements that were built on exploitation and that ended in ruin? These questions had no easy answers, and the virtual mansion, perhaps more effectively than any book or documentary, brought them into sharp focus. Standing in the virtual ballroom, admiring the play of light on the polished floor and the elegance of the space's proportions, it was impossible not to feel a sense of loss for something that had been destroyed. But that feeling of loss coexisted with knowledge of the suffering that had made the ballroom possible. The workers who had died building it, the families destroyed by Blackwood's financial collapse, the social costs of allowing such extreme concentration of wealth. The virtual mansion project sparked renewed interest in Blackwood's story and in the broader history of Gilded Age mansions. Historians and architects who had been studying these buildings for years found new audiences for their work. Descendants of people who had worked on the mansion or been affected by Blackwood's collapse came forward with family stories and artifacts that added new dimensions to the historical record. The mansion, though destroyed more than a century earlier, became more present in cultural consciousness than it had been in decades. This renewed attention led to new discoveries. In 2021, a graduate student researching labor history in the Hudson Valley found a previously unknown cache of letters in a local historical society's archives. The letters had been written by workers involved in the mansion's construction, sent to family members back in Europe or in other parts of America. They provided intimate glimpses into the daily lives of the people who had built Blackwood's palace, describing their working conditions, their hopes and fears, their reactions to the grand project they were creating. One letter, written by an Irish carpenter named Michael O'Brien to his brother in Boston, described working on the mansion's grand staircase. O'Brien wrote about the beauty of the marble they were installing, noting that he had never seen stone of such quality or worked on a project of such scale. He was proud of his craftsmanship and believed he was creating something that would last for centuries, becoming a landmark that people would travel to see. But he also wrote about the harsh conditions, the long hours, the inadequate food, and the constant danger. He mentioned several workers who had been injured, and he expressed fear that he might be hurt or killed before the project was complete. O'Brien's letter ended with a poignant reflection. He wrote that sometimes, when he stood back and looked at the staircase taking shape, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was proud of what he was creating, but he also felt a kind of anger, knowing that he would never live in a house like this, that his children would never walk up stairs made of such fine marble. He wondered whether it was right for one man to have so much while others had so little, and whether the beauty of what they were creating justified the cost in human terms. These were radical thoughts for the period, and O'Brien concluded by noting that he could not share them with his fellow workers for fear of being branded a troublemaker and losing his job. Letters like O'Brien's humanized the story of the mansion's construction in ways that statistics and general historical accounts could not. They revealed the workers as individual human beings with thoughts and feelings, not just anonymous laborers whose suffering could be abstracted into historical analysis. They showed that the people who built the mansion were aware of the contradictions inherent in the project, that they struggled with the moral dimensions of creating luxury for the wealthy while they themselves lived in poverty. Their voices, preserved in letters that had survived by chance, demanded to be heard and considered as part of the mansion's legacy. The contemporary resonance of Blackwood's the story was powerfully demonstrated in 2023 when a major recession threatened the American economy, triggered in part by instability in financial markets that many observers compared to the Panic of 1873. As businesses failed and unemployment rose, references to Blackwood and his mansion appeared frequently in media coverage. Editorials used the story as a warning about the dangers of financial speculation and inadequate regulation. Political activists cited it as evidence of the need for greater economic equality and stronger protection for workers. During this period, tours of the site where the mansion had stood became increasingly popular. The small park with its historical marker became a pilgrimage site for people trying to understand the economic forces affecting their own lives through the lens of history. Visitors stood on the grass, reading the marker and trying to imagine the vast building that had once occupied this space. Some took photographs, others simply stood silently, perhaps contemplating the impermanence of wealth and power, the cyclical nature of economic crisis, the human costs of systemic failures. Local historians organized walking tours that covered the entire former estate, pointing out where different buildings and features had been located. They told stories about Blackwood, about the workers who built the mansion, about the families who had lost their savings when his empire collapsed. These tours became unexpectedly popular, attracting not just history enthusiasts but also people who were experiencing their own economic hardships and who found something meaningful in connecting with this historical tragedy. Tours also visited the cemetery where Blackwood was buried. His grave was modest, marked by a simple headstone that gave his name and dates of birth and death. There was no mention of his achievements, no reference to the railroad empire or the mansion. Nothing to indicate that this was the final resting place of a man who had once been among the most powerful in America. The stark simplicity of the grave stood in sharp contrast to the grandeur he had sought in life, and visitors often commented on this contrast, seeing in it a kind of leveling, a reminder that death comes to all regardless of wealth or status. Near Blackwood's grave was another stone that drew the attention of tour guides and visitors. It marked the burial place of Giovanni Rossi, the Italian stonemason who had been killed during the mansion's construction. Rossi's grave was even simpler than Blackwood's, bearing only his name, the year of his death, and a brief inscription in Italian that translated to "far from home." The proximity of these two graves, the builder and one of those who had built for him, it seems to encapsulate something essential about the mansion's story: the connection between wealth and labor, between ambition and sacrifice, between those who dreamed grand dreams and those who paid the price for those dreams. A tradition developed among visitors of leaving small stones on Rossi's grave, a gesture of remembrance borrowed from Jewish burial customs. These stones accumulated over time, creating a small cairn that spoke to the desire of contemporary people to honor the memory of workers whose contributions had been forgotten or minimized by history. The gesture was symbolic but meaningful, an acknowledgement that the story of the mansion was not just about Blackwood but about the hundreds of workers who had created it, many of whose names were never recorded and whose stories would never be fully known. The academic study of Blackwood and his mansion continued to evolve with each generation of scholars, bringing new questions and methodologies to the subject. In the 2020s, digital humanities researchers used data analysis techniques to examine patterns in Blackwood's business transactions and correspondence, creating network diagrams that visualized the complex web of relationships and financial flows that had characterized his empire. These visualizations revealed structures and patterns that had not been apparent from traditional historical analysis, showing how Blackwood's various enterprises were interconnected in ways that created both synergies and vulnerabilities. Other researchers focused on comparative studies, examining Blackwood's mansion alongside similar grand estates built by his contemporaries. This research showed that while Blackwood's mansion was extreme in its cost and its fate, it was not unique in its conception or purpose. Many Gilded Age industrialists built grand estates as symbols of their success and power. Some, like the Vanderbilt families, built more estate, survived, and eventually became historic sites and tourist attractions. Others, like Blackwood's mansion, were destroyed or fell into ruin, victims of changing economic circumstances and shifting attitudes about private wealth and public benefit. The comparative analysis raised interesting questions about what factors determined which estates survived and which were lost. Physical preservation was partly a matter of luck. Estates that passed to heirs who were both willing and able to maintain them, or that were located in areas where land values made preservation economically viable, had better chances of survival. But there was also a cultural dimension. Estates associated with families who remained prominent and respected tended to be better preserved, while those linked to scandals or failures were more vulnerable to destruction or neglect. Blackwood's mansion fell into the latter category. The stigma of his bankruptcy and the dramatic nature of his fall meant that there was no constituency advocating for the mansion's preservation. His own family wanted nothing to do with it. The local community associated it with economic hardship. Preservationists of the period, focused on colonial and early federal architecture, showed little interest in what they viewed as a recent and excessive building. The mansion's destruction was thus overdetermined, the result of multiple factors all pushing in the same direction. Yet the destruction of the mansion may have paradoxically ensured its cultural immortality. Had the building survived, it might have become just another historic house museum, interesting to architectural scholars and history enthusiasts but not widely known to the general public. Its destruction created a void, a mystery, a sense of loss that made it more compelling than its survival might have been. The mansion became famous precisely because it was gone, because it existed only in fragments and memories and imagination. Its absence gave it a power that presence might not have provided. This observation about the power of absence applied not just to the physical building but to many aspects of Blackwood's story. The gaps in the historical record, the questions that could never be fully answered, the inner life of a man whose thoughts were recorded only all of these created space for interpretation and imagination. Blackwood remained an enigma, a figure who could be understood in different ways depending on which evidence one emphasized and what questions one asked. This ambiguity was frustrating to historians who valued definitive answers, but it was also part of what made the story compelling, allowing it to serve as a screen onto which each generation could project its own concerns. As we move further into the 21st century, Blackwood's mansion continues to fascinate, its story retold in different media and reinterpreted through different lenses. It has been the subject of podcasts and YouTube videos, of academic conferences and popular histories, of novels and works of art. Each retelling adds new layers to the story, while the core narrative remains constant. A man built a palace, lost everything, and died broken, leaving behind a legacy that is still being debated more than a century later. The story resonates because it speaks to fundamental human experiences and questions. What is the cost of ambition? How do we balance personal dreams against responsibilities to others? What remains when material success is stripped away? How should we remember those who achieved great things through questionable means? These are not questions specific to Blackwood or to the Gilded Age, but eternal questions that every individual and every society must grapple with in some form. The mansion, in its absence, serves as a monument to these questions. It reminds us that the grandest achievements can be fragile, that wealth and power can evaporate, that the creations we believe will outlast us may be destroyed before we are gone. It reminds us of the human cost of grand projects, the workers who suffer and die so that others can realize their visions. It reminds us that economic systems can fail catastrophically, that interconnected networks of debt and credit can collapse, that financial panic can destroy not just the reckless but also the innocent. But the mansion also reminds us of human capacity for creation and beauty. Whatever Blackwood's flaws, whatever the moral compromises involved in its construction, the mansion was, by all accounts, a remarkable achievement. A building that combined artistry and engineering in ways that moved those who experienced it. The workers who built it, despite the harsh conditions and inadequate compensation, created something magnificent. Their craftsmanship and skill produced beauty that, for a brief moment in history, existed in the world. That this beauty was destroyed does not negate the achievement of its creation. It adds tragedy to the story but does not erase what was accomplished in the end. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of Blackwood's mansion. That human endeavors contain within them both achievement and tragedy, creation and destruction, beauty and suffering. These elements are not separable but intertwined, each giving meaning to the others. We cannot celebrate the mansion's beauty without acknowledging the cost of that beauty. We cannot condemn Blackwood's recklessness without recognizing his vision. We cannot mourn the building's destruction without understanding why it was destroyed. The story of the mansion is a story about America itself, about a nation that has always been characterized by grand ambitions and willingness to take enormous risks, by rapid creation and equally rapid destruction, by stunning achievements built on foundations of exploitation and inequality. It is a story about the costs of progress and the price of dreams, about what we create and what we destroy in the pursuit of our visions of greatness. Standing today on the site where the mansion once stood, looking out over the landscape that Blackwood tried to shape to his vision, it is impossible not to feel the weight of this history. The houses that now occupy the land are ordinary, comfortable homes where families live their lives unaware of or unconcerned with the dramatic events that occurred on this soil. The grass grows, the seasons change, and the world moves forward, indifferent to the passions and tragedies of the past. But for those who know the story, the site carries a different resonance. The ground beneath these ordinary houses was once the foundation of extraordinary ambition. The air that blows across this landscape once carried the sounds of hundreds of workers, the clang of hammers on stone, the rumble of wagons delivering materials, the shouts of foremen directing the construction of a palace. The dirt now covered by suburban lawns once supported gardens designed by America's greatest landscape architect, fountains that sparkled in the sun, gravel paths where Blackwood walked in his dreams of triumph. All of that is gone now, reduced to fragments and photographs and stories passed down through generations. But the resonance remains, felt by those who stand on this spot and allow themselves to imagine what was here, what was lost, what it all meant. The mansion is gone, but its ghost lingers, asking questions that we are still trying to answer, telling a story that we are still trying to understand. And so we return to the beginning, to a story of ambition and failure, of creation and destruction, of a mansion that bankrupted a railroad king and left behind lessons that echo through the ages. This is the story of James Fitzgerald Blackwood and the palace that destroyed him, a dark tale from America's Gilded Age that illuminates truths about wealth and power, about human nature and the costs of our dreams. Thank you for joining us here at the Dark Estate for this deep exploration into one of history's most fascinating and tragic architectural stories. If this tale of ambition, greed, and ultimate ruin captivated you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another dark journey through the hidden histories of America's grandest and most cursed estates. Give this video a like if you enjoyed this in-depth investigation. And please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on Blackwood's tragic story. What other dark histories from the Gilded Age should we uncover next? Your suggestions help guide our research into the shadows of the past. Until next time, remember that behind every magnificent facade lies a story that history often prefers to forget.